Good day, and welcome to the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation's webinar entitled Ukraine and Russia, A Troubled History. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of CAEF and your host. CAEF's mission is to educate about anti-Semitism as well as hatred directed at other persecuted minorities. Through education and advocacy, through allyships and direct action, we are addressing some of the worst instances of anti-Semitism, a hate that seems to daily find new expression in our otherwise just and peaceful society. To help us in this work, we invite you to volunteer, to donate, or to participate in ways that help educate both the Jewish and non-Jewish public. To do any of these things, if you'd like to be involved, please go to our website, www.caef.ca, or contact me directly at Andrea, ANDRIA, at caef.ca. If you would like to sponsor a webinar, please contact me. I would like to extend our sincerest thanks to our promotional partners for today's webinar: the Atlanta Israel Coalition, International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, Club Z, Israel Activist Calendar, the Lawfare Project, the Mattathias Project, Addith Israel Congregation, the Ludger Congregation, NCSY Canada, J-Teach, Americans for a Safe Israel, the Israel Committee of Sonoma County, Jewish Resistance, End Jew Hatred Canada, and the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. Today's topic is a slight digression from the focus of most of the web talks we've offered over the past 2 years, which primarily address the many aspects of anti-Semitism, its sources, characteristics, and variations, as well as strategies and solutions to counter this ancient and rabid disease, best described as Jew hatred. We have examined Jew hatred in many countries, noting that even when it has not historically been an issue, such as in India, it is increasingly so today. Even where there are few or no Jews, there are instances of anti-Semitism. So it's pretty much a universal idea that whatever is considered evil can be blamed on the Jewish people. And today, the Jew is Israel. Facts and truth don't matter. Ignorance fuels hatred, and the seeds of Jew hatred are being planted everywhere. In every country where Jews have lived, there have been times, even eras, of simmering anti-Semitism or of boiling over hatred. Harassment, discrimination, riots, and pogroms feature greatly in the history of much of Europe, especially Eastern Europe. Perhaps we need a much deeper understanding of history to understand today's anti-Semitism. What do we know of the historical background of the current war between Russia and Ukraine today? This war has Western nations very concerned. It is not focused on Jews per se, though there have been references to anti-Semitism, as the leaders in both countries would have people believe the other is anti-Semitic. It would seem that both Russia and Ukraine have found fodder in anti-Semitism to vilify their opponent. What are the historic roots of the animosity between these two countries? One might better ask, where and when did these two countries come into being, since one claims the other doesn't even exist as a separate national identity? To address the historical questions, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Christophe Gassenschmidt, who is addressing us today from Greece, where he is an associate professor in the Department of History, Philosophy, and the Ancient World at the American College of Greece. He teaches various undergraduate courses in American and Russian history, as well as thematic courses on the Enlightenment, slaves and slavery in the US, and modern European anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. He is also engaged in the college's Model United Nations Club, where he serves as the academic advisor. He's also running a lecture series in conjunction with the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, and he's become an ISGAP Research Fellow. His current research focuses on modern anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Dr. Gassenschmidt has published and presented papers at various international conferences and seminars on American, Russian, and German history and Holocaust studies. Dr. Gassenschmidt has an MA in Modern European History, East European History, and European Ethnology from the Albert Ludwig Universität in Freiburg, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Modern European History from Oxford University. Christophe has been living in and teaching in Greece since 1996, so he has a command of Greek, German, and English. But in addition, I learned he's also familiar with Yiddish and Russian, as he specialized in aspects of Jewish history. His PhD thesis was on Jewish liberal politics in Tsarist Russia, and his favorite writer is Sholem Aleichem. Growing up in Baden-Baden, Germany, Christophe learned that he has some Jewish roots. He learned much about life and how to be an upstanding man from his mother, and he sought out the stories of his grandparents to determine their role, if any, under Nazi-controlled Germany. This led him to know of the quality and character of his two grandfathers, both in their own way were Nazi resistors. It also somehow brought him to a lifelong interest in the Jewish people and our ever so complicated history. Thanks to people like Christophe, we are being given insights into our own history. It is with great pleasure that I invite my new friend, Christophe Gassenschmidt, to speak now and to answer questions from the audience following his talk. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function on your screen, and please try to limit chat so as not to distract others from listening. The talk is being recorded and the recording will be shared. Welcome, Christophe.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. I might add that I'm, reading and more than 40 years on Russian history, literature, etc. And I'm teaching, as Andrea said, since 26 years at the American College of Greece. And before that, I was also coming back to my home university in Germany and was actually doing a research project on the Volga German Soviet Republic. So I do have a good insight into the views of the Soviet Union on the ethnic minorities. Yeah, so that fits actually our topic today, because that's a very problematic thing. I have to say it has been a real challenge to prepare this, talk, because I'm limited obviously to 30 to 40 minutes, and I try to do my best to summarize 2,000 years of Russian history, or the history of the region, let's say, put it this way. Okay, so have some patience with me, because if you want to have an idea of the region and that, you need to understand that this region has been inhabited by many different ethnic groups. Yeah, so that raises one of the big issues that is in the dispute right now, that Putin claims, that the Ukrainians are not a distinctly different nation, and I have to say he has a point there, and you will see why. Okay, I mean, and I have to make sure also that you understand I'm not siding with anyone. I'm just giving you a historical account of the time period, okay? Nothing else. Yeah, and so let's go down there. We have the first Russian state was the so-called Kievan Rus, and before the Kievan Rus, you can see that many different, ethnic groups have been living in the area, including here the Greeks, that I live among them now, because Greeks have been living all around the Mediterranean Sea, as you might know, but there were also Scythians and Sarmatians and even Iranians lived in that area. Okay, so I try to make it rather quick here, just to show you, what kind of people live there, and so you get a sense of what the Russians always claim, that they're always threatened by something. Now, whether this is a phobia or is another issue, other people have to decide that. But it has been a reality that this region has been, invaded, so to speak, by many different groups. And this has to do with geographic reasons, because the Ural Mountains are very flat, so to speak. So people from Asia can easily enter European Russia. Yeah, it's not like the United States, where you have the Rocky Mountains, which were very difficult to pass. And then came the Avars that ruled, as you can see here, Russia for more than 100 years. And for the Jewish people, it's interesting that the Khazars also had their, empire, so to speak, there, and they converted to Judaism. yeah, the Khazars. It's an interesting people. And then we have the Kievan Rus. And here in the Kievan Rus, we have already controversies. Where does this come from, the Kievan Rus, the first Russian state? And there are two theories. One is the Norman theory, that the first rulers were actually Vikings, Normans. The other thing is the Russian theory, which is advanced by the Russians, obviously. And the interesting thing was that in the Soviet Union, it was forbidden to even mention the Norman theory. I mean, you could have been placed in prison or God knows what else, even worse, if you would commit that mistake, so to speak. So you had to advance that Russia belongs to the Russians and was created by the Russians. But as you can see here, and that's a fascinating story about the Normans or Vikings, that they assimilated pretty quickly with like 1 or 2 generations into the local culture everywhere in Europe. Yeah. And this has a reason in, let's say, the cultural aspects and in religious aspects, because you might know that only men and warriors could enter Valhalla, I mean heaven, while in Christianity, everybody could enter, let's say, heaven. And this was very attractive, especially to Viking or Norman women. Yeah. Anyway, or anyone that was not qualified to get into Valhalla, so to speak. Then it comes, the whole thing comes from basically the first Russian ruler, Rus, called Rurik. And that's definitely a Nordic name, a Norman name. So the first ruler was by definition a Viking, so to speak. The Vikings, you can see here the Kievan Rus. And you see, it doesn't include the traditional southern part of the Ukraine, okay? It's rather, let's say, a general, let's say, of central Russia and northern Russia, let's say, centering, let's say, what's nowadays Finland, etc. Yeah. So then the Mongols or Tatars, let's say, invaded in the 13th century, and they ruled in Russia for about 140 years. Actually, they left their legacy in the Russian language because the word for 40 is called sorok, because they asked the Russians to pay tribute to them, and everything was counted in 40. Yeah. So 5 times 40, 10 times 40, 20 times 40, and so forth. And here you go. This is like, that's what the consists, I mean, like, it's the Mongol Empire, so to speak. The Russians were rather, I mean, at this point, there were Russian princes and principalities, but they were not united. They were actually competing with one another. And the Mongols exploited that skillfully, or the Tatars, whatever you want to call them. And they played them, let's say, against each other. And the Russians played this game for a very long time. Okay. And they even used also the Tatars to fight their neighbors and all that. So Russian history is a long history of basically disunity. Yeah. I mean, it took the Russians about hundreds of years until the 16th century to become united. Yeah, not before. So to talk about this area that there is let's say, a Russian nation and a Ukrainian nation is extremely problematic because none of them really existed. Yeah, the concept of, you will see later, of a nation and of let's say, national identity did not appear in Europe before the 19th century. So there you go. The Mongols didn't care about anything else than tribute and money. Yeah. So other than that, they did not get involved in the local culture or the legal anyway. So eventually, at the end of the 14th century, the Prince of Moscow, Dmitry, defeated the Mongols in a major battle. And then the Mongols were pushed back basically out of European Russia. But, and that's important for us in the, let's say, in the narrative nowadays and in the debate nowadays, they left a great deal of people behind in the Crimea. So the Crimea, for instance, is inhabited by quite a few, let's say, ethnic groups. I mean, there is this urban legend, or how can I name it, that the Crimea has always been Ukrainian. That's not true. Yeah, it was actually handed over to the Ukrainians by Khrushchev, who was himself Ukrainian. Anyway, it's another story. That doesn't belong here now. As I said, you know, like the next power center was Novgorod, basically. It depended on the period of the time, on the circumstances, that the power centers in Russia changed from the south to the north. Eventually, it became Moscow, because Moscow was geographically an area that was basically having access to rivers in all directions. Yeah, that was very important because it was also protected, so to speak, by the rivers. And the first, I mean, a certain stability came into Russia with the startup of the dynasty of the Romanovs in the 17th century. And as you may know, the Romanov ruled Russia until the end of the Russian Empire. The last Romanov was, as you may know, Nicholas II. Here you see one of the, let's say, fortresses, just to give you an idea about the architecture and things in Russia. So, and then here you see the area of Moscow, and you see the rivers and the cities nearby. Actually, I had the pleasure to spend some time in Moscow and also in some cities like what you see south of Moscow in Ryazan. Very interesting cities. I did my research there. So a very important segment of the let's say the population in what is called the Ukraine were the Cossacks. Yeah, originally they were basically Russian farmers that escaped from the Russian tax authorities and seek some freedom, freedom like more independence, but not political independence, more like physical independence, independence from tax pressures and all these kind of things, financial pressures, etc. And the problem was that these people has basically developed their own culture, their own things, and they try to establish basically not a nation at all, because the Cossacks lived there in different regions in the Ukraine, in the Kuban area, in the Don area, etc. They're all over the place, and each of them was more or less independent. And here you have to know one thing: here and there, when the people, the farmers next to the Cossacks, felt pressured, I mean, economically speaking, especially, they rose up against the Tsars. And what you should also know is that the Cossacks were used both by the Polish and by the Russians to play them against each other, so to speak. Not against each other, the Cossacks, but the Polish tried to instrumentalize them against the Russians and vice versa. Yeah, because they were a fighting force. They were, let's say, horseback riders and all that. So they were a valuable fighting force. And also what you have to understand is in Russia, they had these popular beliefs that whenever they felt that there's something suspicious going on in the Russian government, people started believing that the right Tsar has been murdered and an imposter was sitting on the throne. So they rose up against the so-called imposter, and that's why you have this uprising, and you have under Catherine the Great the Pugachev uprising, which was the same thing several decades or 100 years later. Okay, so every so often you have these uprisings, and this established a little bit of the idea that the Ukraine is a problematic area. Yeah, where there is social unrest, there is problems, and this was going on until basically the Soviet Union. And you will see later, I bring some examples when we get to Lenin and Stalin and all that. Here you see an image of the Russian painter Ilya Repin that describes, depict, let's say, Cossack culture and all that in this image here. And you see they're quite, let's say, different from Russian people, kind of wild people in a way. It was not quite exactly like this, but anyway. So then came the trouble areas under Ivan IV, which was still, Russia was still not solid, not stable. That came with Russian Tsar Peter the Great at the end of the 17th century into the 18th century. But he again experienced, let's say, that's why I call the talk Troubled History, because he had to, in order to, let's say, get access to the sea, to establish Russia in the diplomatic concert of Europe, he needed a port city to found a port city, which he did with St. Petersburg, which was founded by him. Okay, and the problem was he had to fight a war, the so-called Great Northern War against Sweden to get that. So when the Swedish, that were the superpower right back then, invaded Russia, because they had a war, obviously, for more than 20 years between them. And when they invaded Russia, they did not go straight to Moscow. They turned down to the south to unite with the Cossacks, to go against the Tsar. So again, it seemed to the Russian rulers, that's at least how I see it, how can I see how they interpret things, you know, because you have to understand that a lot is about perception. What the Russian leaders think, you know, they see. Yeah, don't judge based on, let's say, objective picture. That's not how the Russians look at it. Yeah, so they look at it from their perspective, right or wrong. That's a different story. So it failed, and the Swedes were eventually defeated in the Battle of Poltava, which is in the southern Ukraine, and. But Peter the Great had that negative experience. So did Catherine the Great with the Pugachev uprising. Again, you know, like an uprising that included thousands of farmers, peasants, etc., and proved to be a real nuisance to the Tsarist government. But eventually, the Cossacks proved unable to overcome the Russian army, so to speak, because obviously they were far more powerful and better armed than the Cossacks. So here you see the conquests. As you can see here, the southern Ukraine was basically conquered by Catherine at the end of the 18th century. And one of the last parts was the Crimea. But you should not commit the mistake or think that they had complete control over these areas, because that was not the case. Yeah, for a very long time, the Ottomans, the Turks, also played a central role in the southern part there. And so the Ukraine has always been a troubled area for the Russians. Yeah, and the problem was that if Russia wanted to become a major economic power in Europe, they needed also access to the Black Sea. And so eventually they got that, but it was a real, let's say, a hard struggle to establish themselves, especially in the Crimea, and eventually establish the port of Sevastopol, which is very important, and which was the seat of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, basically. And that caused one of the problems when the Ukraine was offered NATO membership and European Union membership, because then in that case, Russia would have lost that port city and a very important base for their fleet, you know, which plays a big role for the Russians. Then again, I'm trying to, let's say, just raise some awareness for the points that Putin makes, that's all. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying, like, you know, these are the points the Russians make, you know, that's a different story. Then with the partition of Poland, and here I get a little bit to the Jewish question, because that was, as Andrea said, part of my, the center of my PhD. It was about Jewish liberals and their attempt to solve the Jewish problem in Russia. And the major part of the Jewish population that eventually constituted the Jewish community in Russia came to Russia with the addition of Polish Russia at the end of the 18th century. Legally speaking, the Russians could not place Jewish people in whatever, let's say, legal system they had. So they considered them nomads. Yeah. And they lived in the so-called Pale of Settlements, that is European Russia. I have an image here that I will show you in a second. And only Jews of the first and second guilds were allowed to live in the major cities. Like, here you go. This is the Pale of Settlements. Yeah, this kind of lighter green area, which is basically European Russia. They were not allowed to settle in Siberia, etc., etc. So they had a rather difficult life. And here you see a typical Jewish shtetl, because the shtetl were the small towns in which most of the Jewish people actually lived. And it was a kind of a miserable lifestyle because they did not really have many professional opportunities to have, let's say, jobs available. And some of them worked as water carriers and all sorts of, let's say, jobs. They actually, let's say, invented certain jobs. Anyway, so to give you an idea of the Jewish shtetl, then, as I just told you, the Russian state built then a fleet, and I mean, they built the port in Sevastopol, as you can see here. And Sevastopol became basically the center of the Black Fleet, the Russian Black Fleet. And so they started to operate from there into, I've named it here Turkey, let's name it Ottoman Empire. And it was the base basically for the trade route towards Asia, India, etc. So then the Crimean War was a reflection of the Russian, let's say, ambitions to expand their empire towards Constantinople, a city that they always considered part of the Orthodox world. And the Russian Tsars always had ambitions to take over that city. And they put a claim on it since God knows how when, I mean, since the city fell, basically. Russia was, you have to understand, Russia was a very backward country until, well, even until the late 19th century. But it was Tsar Alexander II that started ruling in Russia in 1855, that introduced some reforms, major reform efforts. And the irony of the story is that this man that wanted to introduce basically constitutional monarchy eventually, or that's what we think, he was murdered by a group of anarchists. Yeah, that's the irony. And as a consequence, pogroms, hundreds of pogroms took place because one of the, let's say, members of the group that killed him was a Jewish woman. Yeah, so they blamed immediately the Jews and the intellectuals and God knows whom. So the plan of the anarchists to, let's say, instigate a revolution didn't work. So these pogroms basically played a major role in the birth of Zionism, as you may know, with Theodor Herzl, etc., in Basel, etc. And because it was pretty clear to the Jewish community in Eastern Europe that they were not welcome in that area. And we have also the Jewish socialists in the so-called Bund, which was the Jewish part of the Russian Social Democratic Party. Here you see an image of pogroms. I think this was one in Odessa or something. I mean, there were pogroms all over the place. It's not only, one of the most famous one was in Kishinev. And Actually, talking about Ukrainian nationalism appeared in the 19th century, just like almost all nationalisms in Europe. And it appeared basically as a reaction to the French occupation, I mean, the Napoleonic occupation of Europe, and eventually exploded in the 1848 revolution, especially in the Habsburg Empire. And so the Ukraine is not much of a difference, you know. And but as I said before, don't get me wrong, but there is, you know, when you talk about the Ukrainians, the question is, whom do you mean? You know, what kind of ethnic group do you mean? You know, because there are quite a few of them. So some scholars believe that the Ukraine comes actually from Russian and means borderlands, which actually fits the role of the Ukraine for hundreds of years, because it was a borderland between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. Yeah. And these are actually my people that I did my research on, the Jewish liberals that came into being during the revolution of 1905. They became parliamentarians in the first Russian Duma, and also in the second Duma and in the third Duma. So they had a presence until World War I in the Dumas. Yeah. Then came, as I said, sorry for rushing through, but I have my time limit and I have to obey to this. So, and then comes a very interesting period of time with the February and October Revolution of 1917, because here you have to know that Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, basically, he promised he wanted to play the role of the champions of ethnical minorities. So he announced, as a response to US President Wilson's demands after World War I, to allow any nation to determine itself future. And he repeated that. But the difference to Wilson was that Lenin didn't really mean it. He assumed that, okay, they might be a little bit independent for a certain while, but then they come back to the Russian motherland, so to speak. Yeah. And the Ukraine, of course, especially during the Russian Civil War, they took it seriously and declared their independence, but it didn't last very long. Until the Red Army invaded the Ukraine and took it back. Because, as I said, you know, the Russians have a tendency not really to accept areas as independent that they deem to be part of Russia. And that's how they look at the Ukraine. Yeah, that's why Putin makes these statements, you know, that he considers the Ukraine part of Russia and not an independent state or anything. You know? So, oops, okay. And again, the Cossacks play a role at this period of time with Skoropadsky, who became the hetman of the Ukraine for a certain while. Here you see an image of the man. And then later it was another, let's say, leader Petyura, who was actually killed after he had to run away and go to exile by a Jewish anarchist, Solomon Schwarzbart, in 1926. Interesting story. And he killed the guy because of the massacres that were actually committed in the Ukraine between 1918 and 1921. Yeah, it's unfortunately a very something that Russia and the Ukraine share, this radical anti-Semitism and this violent anti-Semitism that ends up in pogroms on end. And this is still the case. You know, we have a very strong neo-Nazi movement in both countries, basically. And strangely enough, you know, although the Germans have destroyed the country, basically, or at least most of it. And then the Ukraine became again a battlefield in the Russian Civil War, when the white Russian generals basically used it as an operation zone against the Bolsheviks and the Bolshevik government. And again, the Ukraine became a problem area. It seemed as if these people are treacherous. You see what I mean? And Then Lenin introduced, in order to get Russia back economically speaking, the new economic policy, which was a mixture of plan economy and free market economy. But then he died suddenly by a stroke, and then Stalin took over. And he had a particular crutch against the Ukrainians, because in 1926, the so-called scissor crisis, you can ask me in the Q&A session if you like some details, created a major crisis, economic crisis and food crisis in Russia, because the Ukraine, you have to understand, was the corn chamber of Russia. So they were dependent on food deliveries, grain deliveries from the Ukraine. And the farmers, not only in the Ukraine, elsewhere as well, refused to, let's say, bring their products, their grain, to the markets, and that caused food shortages. So let me see. Here you see, that's why Stalin decided, okay, I basically nationalize all farms, all things, and collectivize them. And he basically created a class struggle between the farmers in order to get them on his side. Yeah, so he basically kicked the so-called rich farmers, the so-called kulaks, out of their farms and gave the land to the poor farmers, so to speak, to get their support. Don't worry, Andrea, I'm gonna finish, let's say, just 2 more slides or so. And in 1932-33, something similar to the Holocaust happened in the Holodomor, as the Ukrainians call it. What happened there was the plan economy didn't work well, and Stalin was in desperate need of money in order to buy machines and machinery. So he basically sealed off the Ukraine and took all the grain and wheat out of the Ukraine in order to sell it to buy machines. Yeah, and as you can see here, if you want to see here some images, according to some estimates, between 7 and 10 million people died there, a horrible death. And let me see, okay. In World War II, the Cossacks and the Ukrainians played again a very sad role, because a lot of auxiliary police units basically served in concentration camps that were actually Ukrainians. And thousands of Cossacks were ready to serve on the German side against Stalin. Hitler, though, did not trust them, so he never really gave them, neither them nor General Vlasov, any weapons. So they were not really used. And after World War II, Stalin took his revenge by killing all these collaborators and the Russian POWs, because they were taken prisoners by the Germans, although they were supposed to commit suicide and not being taken prisoners of war. So, and then came the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, I have to finish now. I think I'm exactly in time. What I have to say is, apparently Gorbachev, when he agreed in the negotiations about German reunification, he agreed to it under the presumption that NATO is not going to expand to the east. Well, look at the map now. So you can, I mean, at least understand the Russian frustrations, etc., that they have reached now the doorsteps of Moscow, so to speak. And so whether it's justified or not, it's a different story, okay? That's how the Russian leadership, or at least Putin, sees it that way. Now, the issue is, how can we solve this problem? It's very difficult, and I have no answer either. But there's no point, you know, we have to talk. I mean, we have to communicate with another. And I have a feeling that Putin has gone too far, and he cannot find a way out of it without losing his face. That's what the French President Macron also, let's say, pointed out, that we have to find a way for Putin to get out of this, how can I say, problematic situation, at least for him, to find a way back to peace, you know, because obviously this is, let's say, unbearable, this whole situation, and the war is just terrible and just, you know, demands innocent victims on end. So And then 1991, you have obviously Ukrainian independence, and the rest, you know, that's it.
Thank
So
you
it
very
was,
much.
I guess I was on time.
You were, yeah, amazing. You did cover hundreds
Sorry,
of
but
years
it's
worth of
difficult to
history.
summarize
I-
2000 years.
Absolutely. I don't think I've ever held anybody exactly to the minute, but thank you for doing that. There's a lot of,
Sure,
I have a lot of questions and several people have submitted them. So let me remind people they can use
sure.
the Q&A function. Couple of things. Can you outline, just so we kind of hold it in our minds, what ethnic groups currently then make up the Ukraine? Is there a Ukrainian identity, or is it that even today in the Ukraine, it's multiple ethnicities?
I believe it's a multi-ethnicity, and to identify exactly who is Ukrainian or not is problematic. But of course, it doesn't mean, and this is what I have pointed out in discussions with my friends and colleagues, it doesn't mean that the Ukraine doesn't have the right to declare its independence. That's a different story.
For sure.
That's a different story. You know, they have the right at any point, any country, any state has the right to declare its independence if they like to do so. You know, and that's what happens. But I think it's still, I mean, as I pointed out, in the Crimea, for instance, you have the Tatars, you know, like the remnants of the Mongols still. And, you know, it's Russia and that area is very similar to the Balkans, where I live in Greece. We have so many issues here because so many ethnic groups have moved through Greece that we still have this huge problem in Macedonia, that, you know, the Macedonians claim to be, let's say, their territory, and the Greeks claim it their territory because it was the birthplace of Alexander the Great and all that. So I think it's a multi-ethnicity. Sorry.
Christophe, can you end your screen sharing, please?
Sorry?
Can you end your screen sharing, please?
Oh, you have to turn off your
Stop.
screen sharing.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, okay, cool, yeah, okay.
Thank you. I didn't realize that was still on.
Thank you for reminding me, I forgot.
Do you think that, given the areas that you described all around the Ukraine were also part of Russia, and we know up until the USSR collapsed, there were multiple other nations, do you think that Putin is going to go aggressively after other areas that were once deemed Russian?
That remains to be seen because, you know, Russia used to have more than 100, I mean, the Russian Empire and also later the Soviet Union had more than 120 different ethnic groups and languages. So it has always been part of Russian history that you have plenty of, let's say, ethnic groups with independent languages. You shouldn't forget also the nomadic tribes in Siberia and all sorts of really, really tiny groups of people, but they have their own language. There has been, I mean, if you look at the Soviet army, the Red Army in the Second World War, let's say, and look at the soldiers, what kind of, where they come from all sorts of ethnic backgrounds. You know, like it was really a reflection of the Russian society. And whether they have ambitions to other areas, difficult now to say, because most areas are now part of NATO. So that might constitute a problem to the Russians. You know, like NATO might respond, hopefully not. But I mean, we have to be very careful that this does not escalate, because then we have a real disaster.
I think that's what Europe mostly, yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's what
we have
Europe most agrees with.
everybody has to be reasonable somehow, and it's difficult, you know, like it has been, I mean, talking about anti-Semitism, you know, like it was not only the Ukraine that helped the Nazis, and many of the Ukrainians were perpetrators, but also in the Baltic states, in Lithuania, anti-Semitism was rampant. Yeah, there, even before the Nazis entered Lithuania, the local people, the Lithuanians, clubbed Jewish people to death in public places in bright daylight. Yeah, and we have photos of that. You can find these photos in YouTube.
I have a question here
Yeah.
from someone with a Russian background. It was mentioned the Avars ruled Russia for some period. Can you state exactly when that was?
I think I mentioned it. I think it was 8th century or something like that. I mean, I don't recall exactly now, because there were so many different groups that roamed, let's say, through Russia. And one has to also remember that the Germanic tribes that eventually ended up in Central Europe and basically brought Rome to its knees, they came from European Russia. Like the Goths had settled, came from Russia, and they were pushed to the west by the Huns, by Attila, and by all the predecessors of Attila, so to speak.
Given that you've been very careful at not giving a political opinion, do you actually have some thoughts about how the war could be resolved? One of the questions I would have asked is, since the majority, we understand, of the residents in Crimea were Russian, could their vote have swayed things such that it could have been negotiated as opposed to an invasion? Do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is difficult because, as you know, we have an expression for people like Putin in Greek, we call these kind of people complexikos. Like he's full of complexes. Yeah, you have to understand Putin comes from the backyards of Leningrad. It was still back then called Leningrad, right? So he moved up the ranks. Okay, so he came from the lower ranks, so to speak, and moved up the party hierarchy and all that. And he wants to prove that he is a powerful man, and that he, let's say, wants Russia to regain its power. He doesn't want to reestablish communism or so, because that's not the point. The point is for Russia to regain its powerful position they used to have in the Cold War. And they feel humiliated, at least the part of, I have Russian friends that do not feel like this, but many Russians actually hate Gorbachev, because they see him as a traitor. Yeah, he has betrayed the Soviet Union. Yeah, and I mean, the West celebrated him, so to speak, but in Russia he's hated to a great extent. Yeah, because he ended basically the Soviet Union.
Right.
Yeah.
So they didn't hate communism enough.
The ironic thing is that Gorbachev actually introduced more freedoms to the Russian people, etc., etc. But at the same time, in Russia, they have this strange thing that they love powerful men. Like many Russian people admire, let's say, Putin for his strength, for his, that he moves up against the Americans, so to speak. That makes some Russians proud. Yeah, I mean, well, it's justified. Andrea, I cannot really tell this. I mean, I have Russian friends, but they're more Western oriented. Of course, they do not share this rather conservative thoughts. And what people also have to realize is, in the German intelligentsia, there has been since Peter the Great debate between, between people where Russia should go to. Should they orient themselves to the West, or should they rather stay in the Slavophile traditions, whatever these are? Yeah, and that has never ended, and that you see until today. Yeah, so it's very hard to predict what Putin is going to do, but we don't get around not to actually deal with him. You cannot just ignore and just boycott Russia and all that. That's not going to get us anywhere. Zelensky tries to I mean, they still negotiate with one another on a daily basis, more or less,
right.
But it seems to be not going anywhere. So I don't know.
You also mentioned that the rise of, or the existence of, Nazis in both countries today.
Yeah.
Can you speak to how significant that is, more or less in one country? The question here is it as high as 20% of Nazis are Ukrainians are Nazis? Or are we talking about small fringe groups?
Well, you cannot really quantify that, but I mean, like anti-Semitic thoughts are rampant in Eastern Europe. I mean, as you know, the blood libel scenario is very, very widespread in Eastern Europe. The belief, I mean, you may remember the Mendel Baylis case and all these various cases, let's say, before World War One, where Jewish people are accused of murdering Christian children and sucking out their blood and bake Easter cookies and I mean, also grotesque belief. And many people believe that. Even Mendel Baylis, when he was acquitted, the jury still believed that there was a blood libel. They just ruled that it was not him, but there must have been some other Jew.
Oh, somebody that did it, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's really crazy. And you can't get it out. And we have it here in Greece also. I call it passive anti-Semitism. They have a lot of, and I hear it also from my students, etc., when they make some really stupid statements, you know, about, oh, the Jews have money and they are rich and God knows what. And then I explain to them for half an hour that this is not the case. And then I get a statement again, yeah, but the Jews are rich. I said, okay, I give up, whatever. I mean, like, you can't talk to people like that. It's impossible.
You can't change
it's useless.
I swing to a slightly different but related topic.
Sure.
You mentioned Israel, but Russia has, I think, also got two faces when it comes to dealing with Israel. Russia has had very positive relations. We certainly heard a lot about Putin being a friend with Netanyahu, vice versa. But we also know, and most people don't want to admit it, that Russia helped to create the PLO, that both Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas were KGB agents, and that the KGB concocted the whole story about a Palestinian identity and have spent billions trying to destroy, well, supporting the BDS movement and trying to undermine Israel.
Yeah.
At the same time, on the face of it, they recognized Israel before many other countries did. So can you help us to understand what that's all about? And where does it really stand vis-a-vis Israel?
I mean, Russia was very positive, was one of, as you said, one of the first countries that basically recognized Israel or let's say welcomed Israel, you know, but at the same time, they discovered, of course, the Arabs as a way to get involved in the Middle East, you know, and then they actually started a Jewish republic in Birobidzhan. Yeah, this was one of their efforts, the Soviet efforts, to show to the world that how they are welcoming ethnic minorities and all that. And they invited especially Russian Jews, but also Jews worldwide, to move to Birobidzhan to create their Jewish community there. But of course, it was a total failure because, I mean, who wants to move to the Mongolian border? I mean,
I told you I was in Azerbaijan. I totally agree with you. I've been
there. And also the word Palestinians was actually basically brought into the discussion by the Russians as a political combat expression, so to speak. I mean, as we all know, I mean, it's been discussed tremendously. I mean, do Palestinians exist or not? You know, our, let's say, scholar Mordecai Kedar talked about it recently. And he basically proved that most of these people that call themselves Palestinians came from neighboring countries and are not, let's say, identified as, let's say, I mean, they come from Iraq, Iran, Syria, and God knows where. Apparently, you can tell this from the Arab names. I'm not an expert on that, but that's what Mordecai said. So, you know, I find it very problematic to create all this. It's very political, this whole debate. And the two sides have to understand also a little bit, that's my view, that they have been used by third countries and third nations for their own power games. I mean, if you see how the state of Israel was created, that's just grotesque. I mean, the whole Middle East is grotesque in the sense that all these countries are completely artificial. Yeah, they have been created by the French and the English, and like randomly. I mean, these people do not belong to each other basically, because it's just a mixed thing. You know, every single Arab state is a kind of a mixed scenario. That's why you had the the lethal civil war in the Lebanon, you know, because of problems created by the French and how they created the constitution for that country, which was problematic in the end. So
the last question is,
sure, go ahead.
Russia is, it seems, heavily involved in Syria.
Mhm.
Syria is heavily influenced by Iran, which is funding Hezbollah, which has been destroying its own people, or certainly the Christian community, as well as trying to attack Israel. But Russia looks away, most of the time they did anyhow, when Israel would bomb military sites in Syria. Given what the Syrian government has done to its own people, given what the Iranians have been doing in Lebanon, is Russia complicit? Is Russia responsible for some of this dreadful, horrific, murderous activity?
Well, that's difficult to determine because people shouldn't forget that the United States and the CIA also is playing games in the Middle East, and that you cannot see, you know, obviously, because these are intelligence services and they do not normally publish their activities. So you have really no idea, or we don't have really an idea who is exactly doing what, you know, and the whole situation is very blurry. And you can, of course, interpret these events on end and come to conclusions, but does it really reflect the reality? It's, I mean, me as a historian, I always have my doubts in terms of, let's say, is this really true, you know? Because I always think, I try to think logically and say, does this make any sense? You know, and I mean, people also forget that the United States has more than 700 military bases all over the world. So, I mean, like, nobody mentions that, you know, and I'm not trying to find an excuse for Russia, but I'm just saying, you know, like people are judging a little bit one-sided in a way, you know, like, because, you know, the United States had also its rather bad influence in the Middle East, and the way Obama pulled out of the area proved to be a disaster, because, you know, like, then we had ISIS and all these catastrophes and things, you know, and there was not much better later on out of Afghanistan, you know, like, you cannot just pull out of this and just leave these poor people there just on their own. And once you have taken a responsibility for an area, you have to go through with it, no matter, okay, it might be a mistake, but, you know, you have to find a different solution, not just pull out. But it's, Andrea, it's very difficult to answer this because it ends up in speculations. Let's say, we don't really know what is really Putin's intentions, or my big question is also, is there going to be some opposition to Putin's policies at some point in Russia? I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Just
because
we're almost at the end, but I would like to
okay,
just comment to you, and that is, do you have anything you want to say about the Ukrainian situation, their perspective, because we've talked a lot about Russia, and you pointed out that the Ukrainians treated the Jews very badly. Is it better? Is life better for Jews in the Ukraine today? Does having Zelensky as the president make a difference? Do you see a solution from his perspective?
That's difficult to say, because I don't have really any information what's happening on a daily basis between Ukrainians and the Jewish citizens, etc. And it's difficult to say. But when I talked about the neo-Nazis, etc., that's an appearance that you have everywhere in Eastern Europe, no matter how many Jews live in a country. You know, as you know, Poland, for instance, has hardly any Jewish people left, and there's also still a certain amount of anti-Semitism there, because as you know, I'm Catholic myself, but Catholicism has a long tradition of, let's say, certain feelings against Jewish people and aversions and all that. And it's difficult to judge, you know, like, do they have a future in the Ukraine or in Eastern Europe? It's very difficult to judge. Okay. And it depends, you know, like in the Western Ukraine, things are different from the Eastern Ukraine. And I mean, one has to, let's say, look into the actual scenarios in, like, as you know, Lemberg or Lviv was a big Jewish settlement also. I mean, not set Jewish settlement, but there were lots of thousands of Jews living there. It was one of the Jewish centers in what is nowadays Ukraine, etc. And so the Western Ukraine direction, Galicia and all that, had a lot of Jewish settlements and all that, and a rich Jewish population, and especially Orthodox Jewish. And it's very hard to predict what's going to happen, you know, like, and I cannot recommend anything because I'm not up there locally, you know, to judge and to recommend anything.
Okay,
You
I'll
know, I
take you
think,
off the hook.
yeah, I mean,
Very
it's
much. I think the point you've made very well is that we have to know history, that we
Yeah.
really have to know history, and that's a huge part of understanding any of the politics of any country today, and the cultural makeup and their values. And we as a people in the West don't study history enough. And certainly with what's going on in Eastern Europe, we have very little knowledge. So thank you very much for 2,000 years worth of history smacked into 40. And I want to thank everyone that signed on today, wish everybody well, and invite you to follow CAEF and join us for another webinar. We are co-hosting a webinar on July the 10th that will also deal with the subject of the Ukraine and Russia. It's being presented by the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, and you're all welcome to register. Have a good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye for now.